Hey there, members of the Night Crew, and folks who just love horror. Welcome to the Night Crew podcast, where shadows breathe and monsters listen. This is the podcast where we get cozy with the creepy, the frightening, and the just plain undead. I'm your host, Brad Ricks. Quick reminder, if you're a fan of the Night Crew podcast and you like to order a t-shirt, they are available on my website, bradricks.com. Hop over and grab yourself one. You can also pick up signed copies of my novels while you're there. Now, also, the Night Crew 3 Hunting Ground, the cover is done. I have seen it. It's awesome. Stay tuned for when I will start posting on what that looks like. It's going to be amazing. All right. Housekeeping over. Let's talk about tonight. So we've been living in werewolf country for a while now. We've been through France, through the Louisiana Bayou, down some dark Wisconsin roads, and into some territory that is considerably older and considerably more sacred. Well, tonight, for our final episode of this little werewolf adjacent series, I want to go somewhere that might surprise you. We're going to Victorian London, and we're going to talk about a book that, on the surface, has nothing to do with werewolves at all. If you picked it out of a lineup, you would say this one has nothing to do. No full moon, no fur, no silver bullets, and no howling at midnight. We're talking about The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Now, I know what some of you are thinking. Brad, that's not a werewolf story. And you're right. Technically. Even officially. But I want to make a case tonight that this book is doing the exact same thing the werewolf myth has always done. It's just doing it in a laboratory coat with a glass of something that looks like port wine and tastes like the end of everything you thought you were. So, lock the door, keep the lights on if you need to, and let's get into it. Before we crack open the story itself, let's talk about the man who wrote it, because Stevenson's life is genuinely fascinating. And once you know it, you see it absolutely all over this book. Robert Louis Stevenson was born in 1850 in Edinburgh, Scotland. And Edinburgh itself is kind of worth a little moment, because it's one of those cities that really seems custom built for Gothic fiction. You've got the polished, elegant Georgian new town sitting right next to the cramped, crumbling, shadow-soaked old town. Two worlds sharing the same skyline, the respectable and the hidden, pressed up against each other. If you were trying to grow up in a place that gave you the concept of duality from birth, Edinburgh would be on the short list. Now, Stevenson was sick most of his childhood. Chronic respiratory illness kept him bedridden for long stretches, which meant a lot of time alone, a lot of time reading, and a lot of time inside his own head. He was also raised in a deeply Calvinist household. Now, if you don't know what Calvinism looks like from the inside, imagine being taught from a very young age that sin is ever present, that the human soul is fundamentally compromised, and that moral failure is always just one bad decision away. And that stayed with him. And yet, as an adult, Stevenson was known as a free spirit, someone who pushed back against the rigid social codes of Victorian society, someone who wanted to live fully and openly in a world that rewarded performance over authenticity. He spent years traveling, chasing better climates for his lungs, living in France, America, and eventually the South Pacific, where he died in 1894 at just 44 years old. As someone who's soon to be 48, that feels very young. By 1886, when Jekyll and Hyde came out, he had already published Treasure Island and had a reputation as a storyteller who could do adventure with real craft. But Jekyll and Hyde was something different. It was really something more personal. The story famously came to him in a dream. His wife Fanny woke him up from a nightmare, and he was, by some accounts, furious at the interruption. He reportedly wrote the first draft in 6 days. Just 6 days as a writer. That is super, super like crazy. And supposedly he did it kind of a fevered burst that he later revised heavily at his wife's suggestion. She apparently read the first draft and told him it needed to be less of a horror shocker and more of an allegory. He listened, he rewrote it, and the version we have now is what came out of that process. It sold around 40,000 copies in the UK within 6 months, which for 1886 is extraordinary. It wasn't just a hit, it entered our language. We still use the phrase Jekyll and Hyde to describe someone who seems to be two different people. That's how thoroughly this story embedded itself in how we think. Now, the fact that it came from a nightmare feels right, doesn't it? I mean, because the book really reads like one. So let's talk about the book itself, because there's a solid chance your understanding of Jekyll and Hyde comes more from pop culture than from the actual text. And the actual text is a lot stranger and a lot more interesting than most adaptations give it credit for. First thing to know, it's short. This is a novella, not a novel. You really can read it in a couple of hours, but it's dense in the way that Victorian Gothic fiction tends to be. Every scene is doing multiple things at once. Second thing, it's not told from Jekyll's perspective. Most adaptations put you inside Jekyll's head from the start. The book does the opposite. The story is told primarily through a lawyer named Gabriel Utterson. And Utterson is, deliberately, one of the least dramatic people in English literature. He's dry. He's methodical. He describes things plainly and without embellishment. And that choice really matters because everything that happens in this story filters through his very sober, very rational lens, which somehow makes it more unsettling, not less. So, Utterson starts hearing about a man named Edward Hyde. And the reports are disturbing, but in a hard to pin down way. Hyde trampled a young girl in the street and didn't stop. He didn't apologize. He didn't really react. He just kept going. And when confronted, he bought his way out of the situation with a check signed by a man Utterson knows. It's his old friend, the respected Dr. Henry Jekyll. Everyone who describes Hyde uses similar language. They say there's something wrong with him, something off, but they can't quite say what. He's not visibly deformed. He's not obviously monstrous, but people react to him the way they'd react to something that wasn't quite right. It's something that triggers that deep animal instinct that says, get away from this. One character says he gives a strong feeling of deformity, even though he can't point to what that deformity actually is. The quality, the wrongness you feel before you can name it, is one of the most effective things in the book. Utterson starts to worry that Hyde has some kind of a hold over Jekyll. Blackmail, maybe. Jekyll has written Hyde into his will as the sole beneficiary. And that's alarming to Utterson because nothing about Hyde seems right. But the mystery deepens. Jekyll seems fine, then withdraws. A prominent man is beaten to death in the street. The only witness is a maid who watches from a window, and Hyde is the suspect. But Hyde vanishes. Jekyll isolates himself completely. His servants grow increasingly desperate. Something is very wrong in that house. And then the resolution comes in two documents found after Jekyll's death. First, a statement from a colleague named Dr. Lanyon, who witnessed something so disturbing that it broke him. The sight of it was enough to kill him. Not physically in that moment, but his mind couldn't hold what he'd seen. He died shortly after, having lost all faith in the world as he understood it. But we don't get the specifics of what he saw until the second document. The second document is Jekyll's own confession, and this is where everything lands. Jekyll explains that he had long believed that human beings contain two natures, the moral and the base, the civilized and the savage, the version you show the world and the version you keep hidden. And he believed that if he could chemically separate those two natures, he could live as both. He could be respectable Dr. Jekyll and also be free of the weight of being respectable Dr. Jekyll. So he developed a compound. He drank it and he became Hyde. Physically different, smaller, younger, unrecognizable, and entirely free of conscience. Hyde could do what Jekyll suppressed. He could be cruel. He could be violent. He could move through the city at night and do as he pleased, and wake up the next morning as a doctor with a good reputation and clean hands. At first, Jekyll stayed in control. Hyde was just a vacation, a door he could open and close. But over time, Hyde started asserting himself. Jekyll began waking up as Hyde without having taken the compound. The transformation became harder to reverse. He ran out of a key ingredient and no substitute worked. And in the end, he was trapped, increasingly, permanently, as Hyde. The thing he had created to escape himself had consumed him. He died by suicide in Hyde's body as the authorities closed in. That's the story. And sitting with it for a minute, it's a tragedy. It's not a monster story. A tragedy about a man who opened a door he couldn't close. All right, now we're going to address the obvious. This is not a werewolf story. It doesn't have the trappings. No moon, no curse, no bite, no silver. It really presents itself as science fiction, Victorian era speculative fiction about what chemistry might unlock. The horror is supposed to feel modern and rational, not folkloric. And yet, strip away the mechanism. Forget the potion. Just look at what's actually happening in this story. You have a respectable man, a pillar of his community, someone who has spent his entire life being good, being proper, being exactly what society asked him to be. And underneath all of that, there is something else, something darker, something that comes out under specific conditions, does terrible things, and then recedes, leaving the good man to deal with the aftermath and act like nothing happened. That is the werewolf story. That is exactly the werewolf story. The werewolf myth, at its core, has always been about the beast underneath civilization. The idea that no matter how thoroughly you dress it up, no matter how many dinner parties you attend, how many social rules you follow, how much of your real self you keep behind a closed door, there is something animal inside you that is waiting. And once it gets out, once you've had a taste of what it's like to operate without the constraints, it gets harder and harder to put back. Jekyll's tragedy isn't just that Hyde is violent. It's that Jekyll enjoyed it. He built Hyde deliberately because he wanted the freedom. He didn't want to be caught. He wanted to act without consequence. And the longer that goes on, the more Hyde grows until the original self is a thing that's fading away. Now, compare that to the classic werewolf arc. Person is bitten, transforms, wakes up with blood on their hands and no memory of the night before, does it again. Over time, the wolf side starts asserting itself more. The human self shrinks. The monster wins. The ending is almost always death, theirs or someone else's. Jekyll and Hyde hits every single one of those beats, just with a laboratory instead of a forest, and a potion instead of a moon. Even the physical transformation works the same way. Hyde is different in the body. He's smaller than Jekyll, younger, but he radiates something that makes people's skin crawl. People can't name it. They just know it's wrong. And Lanyon, who witnesses the transformation back from Hyde into Jekyll, is destroyed by what he sees. The sight alone is enough to kill him. That's the same visceral bodily horror that makes werewolf transformation scenes so effective. The wrongness of a body becoming something it shouldn't be. There's also the detail that Hyde gets stronger over time, which runs parallel to almost every werewolf story ever told. The beast doesn't stay at bay forever. It learns, it grows, it figures out the schedule, and eventually it starts showing up when it wasn't invited. Now, let me walk through some specific elements of the story that I think are doing exactly what werewolf lore does, just in different clothes. First, the duality of the respected man. Every culture that has a werewolf tradition wrestles with the same fear. That the person who looks normal, who functions normally, who sits in church with you, who you pass on the street and nod to, might be something else entirely after dark. The horror isn't just the violence, it's the proximity, it's the familiarity, it's the fact that you would never know. Jekyll is that fear made explicit. He's a doctor, a man of science, a man trusted with the health and lives of his patients. And he has been leading a double life the entire time. The whole community thinks they know him, but they don't. Now, which is more unsettling? A monster you can identify on sight, or a monster you've had to dinner? Second, the loss of control arc. One of the things that makes werewolf mythology so durable is the progression. It starts manageable. The transformed person can still come back, but each time it happens, something shifts. The beast holds on a little longer, demands a little more, and the human self has to fight harder to reclaim the will. Jekyll describes this exact progression. The early transformations were exhilarating. He was in charge. He could step into Hyde and step back out, like changing a costume. Then it started happening without the compound. Then the compound stopped working reliably. Then he was waking up as Hyde more than he was waking up as himself. The beast was winning. And by the time he understood how completely he'd lost, there was nothing left to do. Third, the physical wrongness. Hyde doesn't look like a monster. He doesn't have fangs. He doesn't have claws. He just looks wrong. And this is the detail that I find really interesting because it's the same thing the best werewolf stories do. The most frightening version of the creature isn't the full wolf, it's the in between. The thing that's almost human, but not quite. Almost animal, but not quite. The uncanny valley dialed up to something you can't unsee. Hyde lives in that space. That's what makes everyone who meets him feel that instinctive pull toward the exit. And fourth, and this is the one that sticks with me, the witness who can't survive what they saw. In the book, Lanyon sees the transformation. He sees Hyde drink the compound and become Jekyll, and he does not recover. The knowledge of it, the visual of it, breaks something in him at a fundamental level. He dies within weeks, essentially of what we might now call severe psychological trauma. The sight of a man changing shape was enough to kill a rational, educated, experienced physician. That detail appears in werewolf mythology constantly. The person who witnesses the transformation and is never the same. Because some things, once seen, cannot be unseen. And once you know what someone really is, you cannot pretend you don't. Now, here's where I think Jekyll and Hyde goes somewhere the werewolf myth doesn't always reach. The werewolf is usually a victim. We feel for the werewolf. The whole tragedy of the mythology is that this person didn't ask for any of it. They were bitten, they were cursed, the beast was imposed on them from outside. And that allows the audience and the character a degree of moral distance. This happened to me. I didn't choose this. Jekyll doesn't have that out. Jekyll chose this. He built the door. He walked through it deliberately. He knew what he was unleashing, and he unleashed it anyway because he wanted the freedom, and more than he feared the consequences. And that is a significantly darker premise because it means the monster was always in there waiting. And all it took was a decision to stop pretending otherwise. Stevenson was writing in Victorian London, which was, in a lot of ways, a society built entirely on that pretending. Respectability was everything. What you showed in public was your whole identity. Your private life, your desires, your appetites, your actual self was something you kept locked in a room that nobody was supposed to know about. The whole culture ran on performance. And what Stevenson was saying underneath the Gothic horror surface was, what if the performance is the lie? What if the thing behind the locked door is just as real or more real than the face you show the world? And what happens when someone decides deliberately to stop keeping it locked? Hyde, interestingly, has no moral sense at all. He's not evil in a calculating way. He's not a villain with a plan. He's evil the way a predator is. He tramples a child and doesn't stop because stopping requires caring that the child actually matters, and Hyde doesn't have that gear. He beats a man to death in the street, and the next morning, he's just gone. No regret, no consequence, nothing. That's actually closer to how the beast functions in werewolf mythology than how most movie villains function. The werewolf doesn't hate you, it doesn't plot against you, it just operates outside the ethical system entirely. It does what it does because that's what it is. Hyde is the same. He's not Dr. Jekyll choosing to be terrible. He's what's left when Dr. Jekyll is completely removed from the equation. And the thing Stevenson understood is the thing that makes this book last is that the terror isn't Hyde. Hyde is just the result. The terror is Jekyll's willingness. The terror is the revelation that inside a good, respected, moral man that was waiting, not planted there by a curse or a bite or bad luck, just waiting. So let's bring this home. We spent this series looking at creatures that live at the edges of the werewolf mythology, things that aren't technically werewolves but carry the same DNA, the same fears, the same structure. The Rougarou was about consequences. Break the rules, break your covenant with your community, and the swamp decides you belong to something darker, the beast as enforcer. The Skinwalker was about choice, something crossing a line they had no business crossing and what it costs. not just to them, but to everyone around them. The monster is transgression. Jekyll and Hyde is about both. It's about a man who breaks the rules he set for himself, pays the ultimate price, and takes other people down with him. It's about transgression and consequences folded together into one person. And it does something that the best werewolf stories do. It makes you feel the pull. Not just the horror of what Jekyll becomes, but the seductive logic of why he did it. Because the Victorian straitjacket is real. The performance is exhausting. The idea of a version of yourself that doesn't have to care what anyone thinks. That's not hard to understand. That's human. The werewolf myth endures because it speaks to something true about being a person. You contain multitudes. Some of those multitudes are not things you'd bring to a dinner party. And the distance between you and the version of yourself that does the thing you'd never do is shorter than you'd like it to be. Jekyll and Hyde just puts that fear under a microscope and says yes. And here's exactly what happens when the distance closes. The monster isn't what bites you. The monster is always there. The monster is already there. The question is just how long you can keep it from getting out. And that, Night Crew, is where we close out the series going from werewolves to werewolf adjacents. We started in the French countryside with the Lougarou, crossed the Atlantic into the Louisiana swamp with the Rougarou, hit the dark roads of Wisconsin, and then pushed into territory considerably older and more sacred with the Skinwalker. And tonight, we ended in a Victorian drawing room with a good man and a very bad decision and a glass of something he should have left on the shelf. I hope you've had as much fun with this series as I have. It genuinely started as one episode about the Rougarou because of a conversation I had with Blaine. And it turned into this whole little series. Which, I mean, that's kind of how the best stuff happens. Now, if tonight's episode or any episode in this series did something for you, do me a favor. Hit subscribe, leave a rating, and share it with a fellow creature of the night. 5 stars preferred. The monsters have spoken. If you want updates on my writing, follow me on Facebook or TikTok at Bradrick's Author. You can find copies of my novels wherever books are sold, but head over to bradricks.com for signed copies. I also got some Night Crew merch, and get on the newsletter. Night Crew 300 Grout is coming, and you want to be the first in line when that drops. I'm Bradricks, reminding you to stay out of graveyards after dark, question people who don't show up in mirrors, and if someone offers you a drink that smells wrong and changes colors, put it down. Whatever door it opens, you're not going to like what's on the other side. Until next time, keep your curtains drawn, your sense of humor sharp, and your blood inside your body. Thanks for listening.